I'm very interested in older people's lives and particularly improving the lives of people with dementia. So I've used diary method with people with dementia and also researched and looked very much at how other researchers have used diary method with people who can often be forgotten about by researchers. Certainly people with dementia are sometimes excluded from research projects altogether because researchers think there's no way we can get any truths, let's say, from somebody with a condition like dementia. So my work's very much been focused upon that.
And I too am interested in older people and those with dementia specifically. The Photovoice work that I'll talk about today has actually been done with those recovering from alcohol-related harm and those with alcohol-related brain damage. So another type of dementia, a different type of dementia from what we perhaps normally think of.
Do you want to tell us, Sarah, what Photovoice is?
So Photovoice started off as a community action approach. It was intended really to galvanise communities, to get them gathered around a particular cause and to collect evidence that would help to make the case for something. So perhaps protecting a local landmark, saving the playing fields, this kind of thing, with a view to coming up with a message. And I suppose we've amended it slightly for research purposes in as much as we've stuck with a lot of it. We've stuck with the photos, we're still trying to gather messages, but perhaps the idea of community has changed slightly in the research context, and we're not looking for just one message to come out of it. We're perhaps looking a little bit more widely. So with Dr. Aisha Holloway here at the University of Edinburgh, we have been gathering information from people with ARBD, alcohol-related brain damage, and those in recovery from alcohol-related harm. And they have been able to take photographs of their life with some guidance from us, but particularly with a rather general brief. So we have specific research questions in mind, but the brief that we've given to participants has been rather general and deliberately general so that they can take the project in their own directions and they can do their own thing with it. We've then discussed the photographs with them and we've been able to move on then into analysis. In the second iteration of the project, we did the analysis with the participants, so it was much more of a co-production, and that was a particularly good experience for everybody. It's been a really interesting way to learn about people and with people, and to allow them to tell their own story, which has been particularly useful for us. But I think the diary method has similar attributes in many cases.
Yes, so I guess diary method, it seems to me the kind of poor relation of the methodological family, I think. Perhaps survey method and interviews are the kind of king and queen, if you like, and that everybody defaults to using interviews or defaults to using survey method. Whereas I think diary method is actually a super flexible tool, can be designed into so many different kinds of studies. You can have a diary design study that's very, very structured and will give you lots of numerical information, lots of quantitative information. Or you can go across the spectrum or across the continuum and thinking about more sort of unstructured approaches. And I imagine most people, their first thought is asking a participant to write in a notebook every single day or every single evening what they've done that day. It's a much more complex tool because it does allow you to get into different areas, into different places and to different kind of thoughts and feelings that you perhaps can't get into with interview method.
So how, Ruth, did you interact with the participants with the diaries?
I asked people with dementia who were activists and they were campaigning and speaking out about their experiences of living with this condition and had early dementia, so they were still able to share their experiences and communicate. But it seemed to me they were already keeping a diary to help them remember where they needed to go and what they needed to do. So the method had some synergy with people's activities. So I think that's always helpful to use a method that already has some synergy with participants so they can kind of build it into their everyday life.
In our projects we use cameras, and I know a lot of people doing Photovoice work are using people's individual phones and people are using their own equipment. Just as you mentioned, some people did incorporate it into their daily life. They really did use the camera to document what they were doing in any case. It wasn't that they took special trips, but there were a very large number of people across both the studies who made very special trips to take photographs and went really out of their way to take particular images in particular creative ways.
And what would you say would be the main difference between Photovoice and, say, a photo diary?
We looked at whether the voice could come through in the photograph. Could you be sure that this image that you were looking at really represented an individual's voice? And I'm not sure you can be sure of that. They may have had all kinds of help to take the photograph, or they may have all kinds of influences on why they chose to take that particular shot. But I think it's also true of interview research. You don't know why people are telling you things, who's prompting them in the background to tell a particular story in a particular way. So I think it's common to other types of qualitative research, that too.
Photovoice, is it always about the individual voice, or is it
The original aim was
project?
very collective, and I think we've started to conceptualise that collective voice slightly differently now. And I know that other Photovoice researchers in the UK have found this too, that sometimes you don't have a group who are centering around a particular cause as you would if you were trying to save the local playing fields. We certainly would think of the community more of a community of interest. So the two groups that we've worked with, the first group were all collected in the room physically, but they were individuals within that room and they didn't interact very much at all. We expected them to. It was set up so that they could, but they didn't choose to do so. So they were very much individuals. And then our second group were people in recovery from alcohol-related harm. They saw themselves as a group and they had a group message from the beginning. And I suppose what was interesting about them is we started with a very clear group message and we ended up with some individual stories from that too. So I think the idea of the group is particularly interesting, whether it's a collective voice or not. I suspect it doesn't have to be, and that we can use Photovoice in a much more individual way as well.
Certainly with diary method, I think there's probably three main reasons why a researcher might opt to use this particular approach. And the first one is to find out about changes within a person over a period of time. For example, researchers have monitored how people cope with coaching, their athletes, and just sort of how they cope with the coaching season and what changes happen over the season. So they use diary method to explore those changes within a person. Another main reason why researchers would opt for this method is it kind of lets you into places that you perhaps otherwise wouldn't see, which I've heard some human geographers actually describe as revelatory places. So places that you perhaps wouldn't see as a researcher. So for example, a girl's bedroom. So a diary can really kind of let you in and open up these spaces that you otherwise wouldn't see. So that's the perhaps second reason for using diary method. It lets you into different places. And the third reason, particularly if you're using video diary and audio diaries, you get to kind of see and hear the person. You get to see and hear the body, if you like, which again can be quite absent sometimes with some methods. The text and the data ends up on a piece of paper in a very unidimensional kind of way. I think that highlights another reason why you might use diary method. It does give participants quite a lot of control over the time and pace of data collection, and I think that's one of the main reasons I like it, because it does enable participation and also give participants quite considerable control over what they share, over how they share it, over when they share it. So it can be a method that's quite equalising, if you like. So I think if you very much value kind of participatory approaches and participatory research, I think methods like diary method can be very modifiable and flexible, and like Photovoice, which is very much about, enabling voice and that kind of thing, are favourable approaches for that reason.
We're trying as well to balance that power gradient a little bit between the participants and the researchers, and try and let them explore things that they wanted to explore. And I suppose one of our bugbears with some of the participatory methods in the past has been that sometimes they're far less participatory than they might actually try to be at the outset. So this does let people have a fair amount of scope. In terms of the practical things, I think we expected, and certainly we were very much warned, that the cameras we would never see again, and we would probably lose most of the equipment. Over the course of 2 projects, we've lost nothing. We've had absolutely everything back. What we learned from that is just how privileged individuals felt about the work, and how they felt a responsibility to the project, and that hinted to us, I suppose, that the power dynamic that we were trying to get had worked, that we had actually managed to balance this out a bit. People did feel really quite invested in the project. They felt that they were being given a voice, they were being allowed to participate, and that they had a responsibility for this kit that they had been given. Did you have experience of the analysis of this data, Ruth? How did you find that?
Perhaps one of the good things and bad things about diary method is that it can encourage disclosure and over-disclosure. So sometimes you get data that just isn't relevant to your study and you perhaps don't need to analyse it, you don't need to store it even or manage it. But I think whenever you're doing it, you need to be prepared for the complexity, the added complexity of data analysis, and also potentially the emotional impact it can have on you in terms of the data that you hear about and the images that you see. I spoke earlier about the project where they asked younger people to keep a video diary of their asthma experiences. Well, one of the participants chose to video herself having an asthma attack. Now, no researcher would interview somebody during an asthma attack. Nobody would. But this participant chose to collect that data as and when her asthma attack was happening. So can you imagine kind of looking at that data, analysing that data and how distressing it probably would be? So I think you need to bear in mind the added complexities and emotional impact that it could possibly have on you, actually watching somebody potentially in distress or hearing someone having real problems, actually describing their life to you. And so that definitely needs to be taken into account, I think, with analysing particularly diary data that's not in a written format.
I don't see myself as artistic and didn't really feel qualified to analyse photos in that way. So we started to focus very clearly on analysing the discussion that came from the photos and what people told us were their reasons for taking the photos and all of that. However, I have to be upfront and say I think that we've drifted slightly into analysing the photos, perhaps slightly unintentionally. We had some very interesting photos, one of a coffee table in somebody's house, which the individual described as their nerve centre, and they had everything there, their medicines, the phone numbers to phone when they got into some kind of difficulty, their lunch, their ashtray, their cigarettes and lighter and all the rest, everything that you need surrounding you. And it just said so much about the individual. And they had very little insight into what we could get from that photograph. So we did start to analyse photos, and we didn't intend to do that. We drifted into that analysis of the image itself. It wasn't really strictly just the narrative that resulted from that. So I think although we set out to analyse just the narrative, we have drifted into the photographs, and I think it's something that we need to think a little bit more about, really, what exactly we're doing with that, because we certainly didn't intend to analyse the images themselves.
Yeah, I think one of the main issues, ethical issues with diary method is privacy. So thinking about where to keep a diary. Certainly educational researchers who have used video diary in schools with children, one of the first things they'll ask is, where's the video going to be situated? I don't want my friends listening to what I'm going to be saying. I don't want it to be situated next to the staff room so teachers can hear what I'm going to be saying. So privacy is a really key issue.
Did you analyse your data with your participants?
I did, for each participant, create a one-page summary of the data I'd collected and then gave that back to participants and said, do you think this is a fair summary of what you've told me, either in the interview or the diary? So that seemed to be one way of kind of just double checking.
We started off with participants who told us that their story was theirs. And we were slightly flabbergasted to start with, because we thought, oh dear, what does this mean? Can we go any further? Do we have to stop? And we ended up discussing with them quite extensively about how we were going to analyse the story. This was a group of people who were told their story in self-help situations quite often, so that it was quite well practised. It was quite interesting to try and work out how we were going to negotiate that. The positive that came out of it was that we did let them tell their story. Then we went away as a research team and we did some analysis, and then we went back and we all met together as a group and we presented our findings, things that we thought had come from the data, and they challenged us and we discussed it. And at the end they said that they had learned things about themselves that they hadn't realised themselves. And at that point the whole atmosphere in the room really changed, and it stopped being just, this is my story and you're not really allowed to hijack it, to be much more of a shared enterprise and much more of a true co-production. But it is a limitation, therefore, of what we were able to do analytically. But it was quite an interesting relationship to try and build around just how far you could push that and where the limit was of what you could do with that. And I think the co-production issue is something that is really very interesting around Photovoice and probably diaries as well.
And I think it's important that we remember the technicalities of method, and even though they can sound quite easy, straightforward, oh yeah, Photovoice, diaries, you just give people a camera, give people a diary and they fill it out and you analyse what they send back. They're actually really technical methods and which you have to obviously develop skills and qualities and attributes, I think, to use them sensitively and to use them wisely with different participants.
Just reflecting on an experience I had many years ago running a diary, and I have to admit it was really to supplement a multi-stage panel survey with pregnant women in the South Wales Valleys, trying to get their understanding of the whole process and how services were working around them. And while some people did take up the diaries and filled them in, quite a lot did not. And part of the reasoning, as far as I could deduce, was a lack of confidence in being able to express themselves using technology, as well as probably a whole spate of other reasons which we didn't really get into. I just wondered to what extent it's enabling people to participate, but not necessarily all people, and how you deal with that problem. Now, this is a problem which obviously lots of methods have problems with, but I just wonder how in this particular case.
We shouldn't assume that it will definitely engage marginalised groups, this. We can assume that it has the potential to engage marginalised groups, but we found that the participants who came to the study knew that there were photos involved and that they were going to get a camera for a period of time to do it, so we didn't have people who came who didn't want to do it, but that was because of the way we'd set it up. The first group who had alcohol-related brain damage, it was less like that because they didn't remember that there was necessarily work involved for them when they came. So I suppose for them, we did have different levels of engagement. We had people who took more photos and some who took rather few. But they all did choose to engage. But I think, as you say, it's because of the way we set it up that they did engage. And I think the danger is assuming that if you do Photovoice, you will always therefore be able to include people. And I don't think you can. I think it will be selective. There will be people who will or won't want to participate. There may be people who are actively put off by being put on the spot with a camera and told to go and do something with it. I think we just have to acknowledge that that is the case with this, that we can encourage people, but it may or may not work.
I have a question concerning the challenges, because we know that spoken language and photography language is very different, because whenever someone is speaking, you can decode what he's saying and what he wants to convey as a message. Whenever you are looking at a photo, there is no static or specific interpretation of that photo. So what do you think the challenges related to photography as a tool of research?
With the photograph, it really leaves open to the interpretation of the viewer, the narrative around that photo, as we heard with seeing the kitchen table. The narrative of that photo was very much left to the viewer. But I guess with any data, it's always open to interpretation to an extent, isn't it? That's why I think it can be important to do it, as part of a team or with participants if that's appropriate. And also bearing in mind, I guess, your research priorities, your disciplinary background, your interests and kind of where you're coming from as a researcher.